Hi, I'm Starship Writer. I've always had a passion for writing, and over the decades I've enjoyed bringing the worlds in my imagination to life through novels and stories. I don't claim to be the ultimate expert, but I have learned a great deal about the craft. And in this series I hope to share some of that experience with those of you who are thinking about writing your own stories. In today's podcast, I want to take a brief look at the characters who inhabit our fictional worlds. Who they are, what they do, and how they shape the stories we tell. If you'd like more insights into the craft of storytelling, you'll find plenty in the Toolbox collection on my Starship Writer Patreon page. Characters are the most important part of any story. They are the ones whose journey we follow. The ones we empathize with. The ones who generate the emotion that keeps us turning pages. A great character doesn't just move through a plot. They create the plot through their choices, their desires, and their flaws. They also hold up a mirror. Through them we often discover things about ourselves that we didn't know, or didn't want to admit. Characters let us explore courage, fear, love, grief, ambition, and identity at a safe distance, while still feeling every beat of it. All the elaborate, fantastical world building an author can create is empty without characters to inhabit it. A world is only as meaningful as the people who struggle, hope, and change within it. Yet even experienced writers sometimes miss opportunities to turn a good character into a great one. A character who surprises us, challenges us, and lingers long after the story ends. Great characters aren't defined by perfection. They're defined by desire, conflict, and change. When those elements align, the story comes alive. But firstly, we need to answer a simple question. What is a character? At first glance, a character is somebody like us but not us. Another human being with their own desires, fears, and contradictions. But in storytelling, a character doesn't have to be human at all. A character can be an animal, a robot, an alien, a ghost, a sentient starship, a talking tree, a shape, a letter of the alphabet, even an idea given form. A character is anything the story allows to act, choose, feel, or change. They don't have to be real. They don't even have to be organic. They simply have to fit the emotional and thematic logic of the story's world. If the story treats something as a being with agency, if it can want, struggle, or transform, then it can be a character. Characters are the vessels through which we experience the narrative. They are the bridge between the reader and the world. They are the emotional core, the moral compass, the source of conflict, and the engine of change. A story can survive without elaborate world building. It can survive without perfect plotting. But it cannot survive without characters. Because characters are how we understand the story. Creating characters needs to be treated with caution. They must fit the purpose of the story. It's one thing to write a weak character who gains strength through effort and struggle. That's growth. But it's another thing to give a character unearned power, or unearned transformation. Readers feel the difference immediately. A character must be capable of facing the task ahead, even if they don't know it yet. Their potential can be hidden, buried, or denied. But it has to be there. Otherwise the story feels dishonest, and the audience disconnects. Writers also need to be mindful of how characters represent ideas, groups, or identities. Characters shouldn't be controversial in a way that harms the story or the reader. It's one thing to explore prejudice, to show how it works, how it wounds, how it can be challenged. It's another to create hate, to reinforce harmful stereotypes, or to use a character as a vessel for cruelty without purpose. Characters carry emotional weight. They shape how readers feel, think, and imagine. So we build them with intention, with awareness, and with respect for the world they inhabit, and the world they reflect. While an author can stir emotion through a character's opinions, beliefs, and actions, we need to be cautious when defining them physically. In film and television, the audience is handed a complete visual package. Watch a Batman movie and you know exactly who you're looking at. The jawline, the cape, the silhouette. The viewer doesn't have to imagine anything. They simply sit back and receive the image. But an author's task is different. We have to create a vision of our characters inside the reader's imagination, and that's where things become delicate. This is a trap many novice authors fall into. We know our characters intimately. We can see them clearly in our minds. Every freckle, every strand of hair, every angle of the jaw. And because we see them so vividly, we often try to describe them in explicit detail. But our readers bring their own imagination to the page. Their own tastes. Their own experiences. Their own cultural background and emotional history. Tell a reader that your heroine is beautiful, and that word means something different to every person who reads it. A woman may imagine one kind of beauty. A man another. And even two men will picture her differently. If we describe her facial features in exhaustive detail, we're not just painting a picture. We're imposing our personal preferences onto someone else's imagination. And that can break the spell. Every reader has lived a different life. Every reader has their own sense of attraction. Their own memories. Their own emotional associations. When we overdescribe, we risk narrowing the character instead of expanding them. We take away the reader's freedom to co-create the story with us. The goal isn't to dictate a person. The goal is to suggest a presence. To give just enough detail for the reader to build their own version of the character. One that feels true to them. Because when a reader imagines a character in their own way, that character becomes personal. And personal characters are the ones that stay with us. While an author is limited in how much they can control a character's appearance, the same is not true for what lives inside that character. A reader will always imagine their own version of the face, the body, the beauty, the posture. They fill in those visual blanks with their own tastes, their own experiences, their own sense of attraction or familiarity. But internally, that's where the reader begins as an empty vessel. They may picture the heroine differently from how we do. But her heart, her fears, her desires, her strengths, and her fault lines, those belong entirely to us. That is where the author's authority is absolute. This is where we shape the story. We decide whether our heroine is kind or cruel, brave or hesitant, loyal or conflicted. We decide whether she will fulfill the hero's dreams or shatter them. We decide whether she rises, falls, betrays, forgives, transforms, or refuses to change at all. The reader may supply the face, but we supply the soul. And that's the moment where authorship truly takes over. Not in the surface details, but in the emotional architecture beneath them. The inner life of a character is where the story's power lives. It's where tension is born, where choices matter, and where the reader becomes invested in what happens next. Because once the reader cares about who the character is, not just what they look like, the story becomes inevitable. They have to follow. They have to know. They have to see what this person will do. That's the real magic of character creation. There are many different kinds of characters we use in novels. Not stereotypes. Not cliches. But the functional roles characters play inside a story. Understanding what each type does allows an author to mix them, invert them, or break them entirely. And that's when the cast-off a story starts to feel alive. Every story orbits someone. In the real world, if you step onto a packed subway at rush hour, You're surrounded by hundreds of possible lives. Each one with its own history. Its own desires. Its own secrets. Your imagination could follow any of them. Stories work the same way. Your fictional world may be filled with countless characters, but a few stand out. And the one we most often meet at the beginning is the protagonist. On the first page. They're usually someone unremarkable, at least on the surface. But the protagonist is the character whose desire drives the narrative forward. They want something. They lack something. And the story forces them to confront that gap. Even if they don't yet understand what that gap is. They don't have to be heroic. They just have to be compelling. And have a to be revealed reason for their future actions. This is sometimes created by an instigator. An instigator is the character who sets the story in motion. They may not stay long. But they matter. As it is through them the protagonist is forced into action. This character can be insignificant, the stranger who arrives. Or a messenger. They don't have to have involvement other than as catalysts that sparks the plot. They light the fuse. As the story unfolds, the protagonist reveals themselves. They may become the classic hero who races in to save the day. Or the reluctant hero dragged into action against their will. They might be the conflicted anti-hero, wrestling with their own darkness. Or the tragic hero whose flaw leads them toward inevitable loss. Each variation brings a different emotional flavor to the story. Many authors stop there. And it works. But there's room for so much more. While we expect the protagonist to grow as their journey progresses, to learn or lose something by the end, we can also shape them into more than a single purpose. One-dimensional figure. A strong protagonist isn't defined by perfection. They're defined by complexity. A strong protagonist has a clear goal. Something that creates drive, urgency, and direction. A flaw or wound. Something they struggle to shake off. Something that shapes their choices. Moments of weakness. They can be distracted, misguided, even disloyal to those who follow them. A belief in something meaningful, even if that belief is challenged or broken along the way. The capacity to change. Whether they rise, fall, or transform in unexpected ways. These elements don't just make the protagonist interesting. They make them human. Even when they're not human at all. But the protagonist isn't just the character we follow. They're the character who changes us as we watch them change. And for them to transform, they must be pushed. They must be challenged. They must be forced into situations they would never choose on their own. That pressure comes from obstacles. Sometimes the obstacle is internal. Fear, dread, shame, guilt. The emotional terrain they'd rather avoid. Sometimes it's external. A storm. A disaster. A horde of zombies. A collapsing world. And sometimes the obstacle is another person. That person is the antagonist. In its simplest form. The antagonist is the character or force that stands in the protagonist's way. Their purpose is to create friction. To delay or derail the protagonist's progress. And to keep the story in motion. They don't just oppose once. They oppose continually. Again and again. As the story ebbs and flows toward its conclusion, we accept this repeated resistance as part of the narrative rhythm. The villain tries. The hero overcomes. The villain tries again. But this can also be a missed opportunity. Why is the antagonist so insistent? Why do they care so deeply about stopping the protagonist? What do they want? Are they a rival? A mirror. A warning. A shadow version of the protagonist. Or someone with their own wound. Their own history. Their own desperate need. The antagonist doesn't have to be evil. In fact, very few people in real life are purely evil. Fiction often simplifies this. But the richest stories give the antagonist a worldview that makes sense to them. even if it clashes with the protagonists. Often the antagonist acts from a different set of expectations, values, or fears. And once those are revealed, their motives become clearer. Sometimes even sympathetic. Sometimes tragic. Sometimes uncomfortably familiar. A great antagonist doesn't just block the protagonist. They define them. They force the protagonist to grow, to confront their own limitations, and to become someone capable of facing the story's final challenge. And in that way, the antagonist is not just the opposition. They are the catalyst for transformation. While the antagonist may have an army of minions at their disposal, the protagonist faces the challenges alone, or with a small band of loyal associates. These are the characters who help the protagonist move forward. They provide skills, perspective, humor, grounding, whatever the story needs in the way of the best friend or sidekick. They may be a mentor or a love interest. Allies reveal who the protagonist is when they're not fighting the plot. The best friend is someone who has always been there for the protagonist. The sidekick, meanwhile, may not share a lifelong bond, but they often share the same values, the same mission, or the same sense of loyalty. Either way, these characters become incredibly useful to the author. Yes, they share the dangers. Yes, they may rescue the protagonist, or need rescuing themselves. Yes, they help fill the spaces between major events. But their real value is something deeper. They give the protagonist a voice. Unless the story is written in first person or a very close limited point of view, the author faces a challenge. The protagonist makes decisions, but they don't announce them out loud. They don't pause mid-journey to explain their reasoning to the empty air. Imagine the protagonist reaches a fork in the road and turns left. Why left? Why now? What do they know that the reader doesn't? They can't mutter. That's the way to the swamp of no return, to nobody in particular. That would feel artificial. But a companion can say it naturally. We can't go that way, that's the road to the swamp of no return. And in that single line, the author accomplishes three things at once. The reader learns essential information. The protagonist's decision becomes clear and justified. The world gains texture and context. The companion becomes the narrative bridge between the protagonist's internal logic and the reader's understanding. They allow the story to reveal information organically, without breaking immersion or forcing awkward exposition. This is why allies, best friends, sidekicks, companions, are more than just extra bodies in the scene. They are the sounding board, the conscience, the comic relief, the emotional anchor, and most importantly, the voice that lets the reader understand what the protagonist cannot say aloud. They don't just accompany the hero. They help the hero make sense. Best friends and sidekicks can also provide comic relief. After a moment of high tension, a well-timed line or reaction gives the reader a chance to breathe. A moment of levity before the next emotional blow. That pause matters. It resets the reader's nerves, sharpens their focus, and prepares them for what comes next. But good comic relief isn't just jokes. It isn't about being funny for the sake of it. It's about contrast. When humor appears in a tense moment, it doesn't weaken the tension. It deepens it. The lightness makes the darkness feel darker. The laugh makes the danger feel sharper. The smile makes the heartbreak hit harder. Comic relief works because it reminds the reader that these characters are human. They cope the way real people cope. With sarcasm, banter, awkwardness, or gallows humor. And when the sidekick or best friend often delivers that moment, it strengthens their bond with the protagonist and with the reader. It's not a distraction. It's a tool. One that, when placed carefully, makes the entire story more alive. While the best friend or sidekick is beside the protagonist through thick and thin, the mentor is an occasional ally. They can come and go at times when information is required that neither the protagonist or friend knows or has access to. The mentor also teaches, warns, or prepares the protagonist. Mentors shape the protagonist's worldview. Think of characters like Gandalf or Obi-Wan Kenobi. These are the classic mentors. The guides who appear at the moment the protagonist needs direction, wisdom, or a push into the unknown. The mentor's role isn't to fight the battles or solve the problems. Their role is to prepare the protagonist for what's coming. And they do this by offering knowledge the protagonist doesn't yet have or warning them of dangers they can't yet see. They may give them tools, skills, insights, challenge assumptions, or nudge the protagonist toward their destiny. But mentors are rarely permanent fixtures. They often appear early, vanish for long stretches, and return only when the story demands it. Sometimes they even die or step aside. Not for shock value, but because the protagonist must eventually stand alone. A mentor doesn't have to be wise, old, or mystical. They can be flawed, reluctant, impatient, or even wrong. What matters is that they change the trajectory of the protagonist's journey. And here's the deeper truth. The mentor is not there to save the hero. They're there to shape the hero. Once the protagonist is ready, or thinks they are, the mentor steps back. Because the story belongs to the protagonist, not the guide. One of the most enduring groupings of characters in storytelling is what I like to call the golden triangle. The protagonist, the sidekick, and the love interest. Think of the early dynamic between Luke, Leia, and Han Solo in Star Wars. We don't yet know who belongs with whom. There's ambiguity, tension, possibility. And that uncertainty drives the emotional undercurrent of the story. Even when it turns out not to be Luke's path, the potential shapes how we read their interactions. The love interest, though, is often misunderstood by novice writers. They can be wasted if they exist only to wait patiently until the protagonist finally notices them. But a love interest can, and should have their own story, their own agency, their own desires. Yet a love interest isn't just romance. They reveal vulnerability, desire, fear, and longing. They expose the protagonist's emotional blind spots, the parts of themselves they'd rather not face. A love interest can take many forms. The soulmate, a forbidden love, the rival-turned-lover, or the love interest who becomes the antagonist. Whatever shape they take, love interests raise emotional stakes. And emotional stakes are often the deepest, most resonant stakes in the entire story. But the love interest can also serve another powerful function. They can act as a foil. A foil is a character who contrasts with the protagonist to highlight the protagonist's traits simply by being their opposite. For example, the optimist versus the cynic, the rule follower versus the rebel, the idealist versus the pragmatist. When the love interest functions as a foil, they sharpen the story's theme. They show us what the protagonist could be, or what they fear becoming. They illuminate the protagonist's strengths, weaknesses, and contradictions simply by standing beside them. The golden triangle works because each point of the triangle reveals something different about the protagonist. The sidekick shows loyalty, camaraderie, and shared purpose. The love interest shows vulnerability, longing, and emotional truth. The protagonist is shaped by both. Together, they create a dynamic that feels alive, unpredictable, and emotionally rich. These are the central characters: the protagonist, the sidekick, the love interest, the mentor, the antagonist. But there are many others who quietly hold the story together. These are the background characters, the people who make the world feel lived in. They're the ones who guard the gates. They crew the spacecraft. They stamp the forms and frustrate the hero with minor bureaucracy. They run the shops, sweep the streets, and fill the taverns. They are the faces in the crowd, the voices in the marketplace, the everyday lives unfolding around the protagonist's journey. The author reveals little about them: a name, a gesture, a single line of dialogue. Yet they add texture, culture, and realism. They remind the reader that the world doesn't revolve entirely around the protagonist. That life continues beyond the hero's immediate concerns. They are a rich pool to draw from when completing the story. A single background character can become a catalyst, a witness, a rumor bearer, or even a future ally. They may appear only once, but their presence expands the world beyond the page. A story without background characters feels empty, like a stage without scenery. A story with them feels alive. When you understand the function of each character type, you stop writing cast lists and start building ecosystems. A story isn't just a collection of individuals. It's a living network of relationships, tensions, loyalties, secrets, and desires. Every character, no matter how small their role may seem, has the potential to enrich that ecosystem. So don't miss the opportunity to explore all of your characters. They can create subplots that run beneath the main narrative. They can reveal backstory through their memories, their scars, or their grudges. They can add new dimensions to the protagonist simply by existing in contrast or conflict with them. A side character's ambition can complicate the hero's journey. A background character's rumor can shift the plot. A minor ally's betrayal can redefine the stakes. Every character is a doorway to possibility. But as you explore them, never forget one essential truth. When describing characters, leave the reader room to imagine them in their own way. Readers bring their own lives, their own tastes, their own emotional history to the page. If you overdefine a character's appearance, you risk closing the door on the reader's imagination. But if you give them space, a gesture, a silhouette, a hint of expression, the reader will fill in the rest with something personal, something meaningful, something that belongs to them. And that's when characters truly come alive. Not just on the page, but in the reader's mind. I hope you found something of interest in this podcast. If you did, you'll find plenty more insights into the craft of building stories in the Toolbox collection over on the Starship Writer Patreon page. It's a growing library of ideas, techniques, and practical guidance for writers at every stage of their journey. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. It helps more storytellers discover the show. And it lets me keep bringing you new episodes on the art and craft of writing.